Bon, eh bien, écoutez, je pense qu'on va commencer. Alors, je me présente, Tristan Landry, je suis professeur d'histoire au département d'histoire de l'Université de Sherbrooke. Avant cela, j'ai été pendant 3 ans coordonnateur scientifique du projet Les Canadiens et leur passé. Donc, je suis très content d'être ici pour vous revoir. Et je suis d'autant plus content que Jocelyn m'a offert d'être président de séance. Alors, je vais simplement vous introduire les présentateurs. Je vais peut-être vous mentionner que non seulement je suis content d'être ici parce que j'ai été dans ce projet, mais aussi parce qu'il rejoint des problématiques qui sont encore les miennes. Je dirige notamment une recherche financée sur les conflits de mémoire. Et il me semble qu'on est ici en plein cœur de ces conflits de mémoire. Bon, des fois, le mot conflit est peut-être un peu trop lourd. Dans le cas de la grosse île comme palimpseste, il faut peut-être parler davantage de concurrence mémorielle. L'espace qui m'occupe est un espace où on doit parler de conflits de mémoire, l'espace post-soviétique, où ces conflits mènent parfois à des affrontements sanglants. Et puis, quelque part entre les deux, il y a ce que M. Rousseau a appelé ce matin un champ de bataille en France, où il y a effectivement des concurrences et même des conflits de mémoire. Alors, notre premier présentateur, je vais présenter les deux présentateurs tout de suite, comme ça après on pourra faire l'enchaînement plus rapidement, est M. Patrick Garcia, qui est maître de conférence en histoire à l'Université de Cergy-Pontoise et chercheur à l'Institut d'histoire du temps présent, et qui a publié l'année dernière un ouvrage co-dirigé et qui a pour titre « Historiographie, concepts et débats », et que je n'ai pas encore lu, mais que je vois fréquemment sur les pupitres de mes étudiants. Alors, il va falloir absolument que je le lise. Et M. Garcia va nous présenter un papier qui s'intitule « L'avenir répond du passé », où il s'interroge sur des problématiques qu'on a vues d'ailleurs ce matin, sur l'histoire productrice d'identités communes, mais dans une perspective particulière, c'est-à-dire l'omniprésence des pouvoirs publics, mais comment la personnalité du président de la République a pu influencer aussi l'évolution, les circonvolutions de ces politiques publiques de mémoire. J'ajoute quelque chose qui n'a rien à voir avec le papier de M. Garcia, mais si on reste en France et dans ces batailles de mémoire, les lois mémorielles ont été très significatives de ce besoin de l'État d'ingérer l'espace public et de vouloir réguler ces conflits de mémoire. Les résultats ne sont pas nécessairement toujours heureux parce que les pouvoirs publics obéissent aussi à des logiques électorales. Ce qui fait que lorsqu'on considère, par exemple, le projet de loi sur le colonialisme, qui voulait réhabiliter en partie l'expérience coloniale, il y avait une logique de séduction électorale, bien sûr, des pieds noirs derrière ça. Et on observe la même chose en Russie, où on reprend le mythe fondateur de la Seconde Guerre mondiale et la personnalité de Staline, sans se soucier du fait que les circassiens, par exemple, pourraient s'en irriter, étant donné qu'ils ont été victimes de grandes déportations du Caucase vers l'Asie centrale pendant la période stalinienne. Donc on voit que les pouvoirs publics sont aussi doivent répondre à des logiques qui ne sont pas à même non plus de servir au mieux la résolution de ces conflits de mémoire. Et c'est d'ailleurs le propos de M. Allan Megill, ou en partie le propos, d'ailleurs je dois mentionner tout de suite que le titre de son intervention a changé, c'est maintenant « The Problem of Identity and Memory as Fixations of the Past », et comme il le dit, c'est une référence à l'expression qu'a utilisée M. Rousseau précédemment dans ce colloque, « Fixations of the Past ». M. Megill enseigne l'histoire moderne européenne intellectuelle à l'Université de Virginie, et il est également l'auteur de Historical Knowledge, Historical Error. Et d'ailleurs, on a beaucoup à échanger sur la Russie, pour laquelle M. Megill nourrit maintenant un intérêt certain. Et il va nous parler de ces différentes problématiques, notamment de solidarité sociale, et à l'heure où il s'opère une sorte de communautarisation des mémoires. Alors, sans plus attendre, je laisse la parole à M. Megill. L'ordre vient de s'inverser abruptement. Et I'm going to be strict on time. You have 30 minutes, and when you see me showing you signs of impatience, you should conclude.
Be within my angle of vision. Well, I'm very pleased, très enchanté d'être ici.
et très reconnaissant d'avoir été invité. I have actually written this paper at the last minute. I decided to write it at the last minute for a number of reasons. Firstly, a written paper ahead of time was not demanded of me, always dangerous. But secondly, I'm an outsider to this project, and I'm speaking toward the end, and I wanted to hear the papers before I decided what it was I was going to say. And so what you have here is something that was written after dinner last night. I missed the legendary double fudge dessert in order to write this paper. It's going to be a little raw. It's not going to be delivered with the kind of smoothness that we saw in the most recent session, but tant pis. I come to this conference as an outsider, as someone who has not been involved in the kinds of research projects and professional duties that have occupied most of the people in this auditorium over the last 3, 5, 10, or even more years. And so I've found it fascinating to hear the presentations of, and to engage in conversation with people who have been concerning themselves with the interface between the work of historians de métier and the involvement of the general public with the past around us. Not something that I usually concern myself with. I have likewise found it interesting to have my attention drawn once again to the complex political dimension of the discourses, and I think that we must speak of discourses in the plural here, of historical representation, historical understanding, and engagement with the past generally. These political dimensions, I find, are often not explicitly addressed or commented on, and yet I see them as essential dimensions of historical representation in its various modalities. Albeit, these are dimensions that are often occulted, or even at the limit raised to the level of mythology. In thinking anew about the political dimensions of historiography, I find that I have been particularly helped by my reading, since arriving in Quebec 3 days ago, of Jocelyn Letourneau's Le Québec entre son passé et ses passages. I must say that I also found very pertinent certain aspects of Henri Rousseau's presentation in the first session of this conference, concerning the historian and the public space, and in particular his suggestion that in the present moment the past is not simply an inheritance, nor is it simply an object of investigation, for it has also become a sector of and for intervention, such that the now pluralized specialists in the representation of the past, which include not only historians in a professional sense, but also filmmakers, writers, memorists, and so on, are asked to retroagir upon the past, engaging in reparative therapy and in general attempting to correct the oversights of previous generations. For the moment, however, I want to stick with Letourneau's Le Québec entre son passé et ses passages, because I find it actually quite éblouissant, depicting a situation that, if we are to trust Letourneau's account, is far more complex and interesting than I had imagined it was as little as 3 days ago. Of course, I must confess that I start out from a base that is one of great ignorance. My first experience with Quebec, and indeed my only extended experience, took place many years ago in the summer of 1968, when I spent 6 weeks, or maybe it was 2 months, at the École française d'été de l'Université de Montréal. À cette époque-là, on parlait, en ce qui concerne le Canada et le Québec, de deux nations, les célèbres deux nations, et de deux solitudes. on s'imaginait deux identités, mais on n'employait pas ce mot identité à cette époque. Deux identités, deux nations bien séparées, avec des frontières entre eux bien définies. On s'imaginait que ces deux identités, nations, existaient à un niveau ontologique très profond. Or, on lit maintenant le livre de Letourneau et on perçoit une réalité très différente de ce que je viens d'esquisser très, très brièvement. For what I find in this book is a nuanced account of an extremely complex reality, or so it seems, a reality that has nothing to do with any notion of a fixed identity, persisting as an essence over time, that thus creates a thread of unbroken continuity from 1759 or even earlier to the present. I'm reminded of Nietzsche's polemic against historical teleology, his polemic against viewing man as if he were eternal, the natural direction of all things in the world from the beginning, and his insistence that everything has become, alles ist geworden, such that there are no eternal facts and no absolute truths. That's Nietzsche in Human All Too Human. But remember, I said that, and I don't want to skip a page here. I have to be very careful not to skip pages, but I think I haven't. Remember, I said that Letourneau's position is a nuanced position. He does not exactly reject the national project. He does not exactly reject the project of identity. And now I quote a few lines of Letourneau. Il est évident que le Québec d'aujourd'hui, malgré la diversité socio-démographique qui le caractérise et les transformations de toute nature qu'il a subies, se situe dans une continuité par rapport à ce qu'il était hier. Que l'on accepte ou non la société québécoise actuelle reste habitée par une communauté d'histoire et de mémoire. Et j'ai omis quelques lignes. Or, ce peuple se définit comme un nous qui, sans cesser de se renouveler au contact de l'autre, et je répète ça, sans cesse, c'est une communauté, c'est un nous qui ne cesse pas de se renouveler du contact de l'autre, entend continuer à s'épanouir dans la suite d'un parcours amorcé il y a des lustres. Il est donc inutile, je continue avec Letourneau, il est donc inutile de nier l'idée d'un nous qui veut exister et durer au Québec. But, Letourneau continues, it is necessary to interrogate this nous, this us. It is necessary to interrogate this us in what it claims or aspires to be. It is necessary to interrogate the Québécois us, revealing it in its ambiguities and dissonances. And as Nietzsche once asked, what is man but dissonance? Revealing it in its ambivalences and its paradoxes, in order calmly to bring it face to face with itself. That's all Letourneau. And finally, Letourneau evokes a post-nationalism that sustains that the nationalitarian paradigm obscures and impoverishes more than it clarifies and enriches our understanding of the historical experience of Québécois. It wishes, still les tourneaux, it wishes to reopen the question of Quebec as, first of all, an analytical question, that, however, the dominant mode of thinking insists on treating as, above all, a political question. And finally, Les Tourneaux, here quoting with approval a colleague, insists that, and now quotation, the identitarian pluralism that manifests itself in Quebec poses in a new way the question of memory and obligates the Québécois to renew their historical consciousness. And again, that's Les Tourneaux, but translated by me into English. This passage and other parts of Les Tourneaux's book I find quite stunning. Let me now try to explain why. I came to this conference expecting to see some things that I did not, in fact, find, or at least I didn't quite find them having the prominence that I expected that they would have. Most importantly, there is now a considerable literature on identity that puts great emphasis on the fact, and it is a fact, that identitarian commitments very often arise within conflictual dyads. It is very often the case that a group, let's call that group A, comes to define itself as a group having the A identity in the context of its finding itself within a conflictual relationship with another group. Let's call this other group Group B. In other words, in the relation of same to other, the same for the first time becomes same. That is the story. There's a huge literature on this phenomenon in history, in social psychology, in cultural sociology, and in philosophy. Of course, there are also classic examples of this sort of situation. The Greeks became Greeks only by reference to the not Greeks, namely the barbarians. Without the barbarians as a counter form, surely it would not have been the case that those scores of Greek city-states would have seen themselves as at some level a unity. And of course, as we know from that famous book, Peasants into Frenchmen by Weber, peasants were turned into Frenchmen only by reference to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and with reference to the need to meet the challenge of the German Empire. But in the sondage that was done for the Canadians and their pasts project, and perhaps also in the research project doing essentially the same thing in Finland, it doesn't seem to have been the case, it does not seem to be the case that the Canadians or Quebecois or Finnish identities were primarily being defined by ordinary people in relation to a hated or feared other. Instead, most of the focus seems to be on personal and family experience, rather than something outside the national or ethnic group against which that group reacts. One important contemporary book on the subject of identity, a quite brilliant book, is Anthony Appiah's The Ethics of Identity. In that work, Appiah spends some time discussing a social psychology experiment conducted many, many years ago in a state park in Oklahoma. I don't think one could do it today because one would have to get permission to do the subject research, and back in the 1950s, people hadn't thought that that was necessary. In this social psychology experiment, two groups of pre-teenage boys were set up in two separate campgrounds, not in sight of each other. Those campgrounds were not in sight of each other, but they were nonetheless quite close. And the purpose here was to study how these two groups would relate to each other and how each group would define itself and the other group. And indeed, the two groups developed conflictual relations with each other, and this did connect with the social cohesion of each group. Each group defined itself as a cohesion against the other group. It is quite possible, however, that this instance is an outlier, or at least not to be taken as normal. Certainly, on Letourneux's account, Québécois identity at the present moment does not primarily define itself against an other to which it relates conflictually. In this regard, we may gain some illumination from Rogers Brubaker's book, Ethnicity Without Groups, and in particular from the second chapter of that book. The second chapter is called Beyond Identity, with identity in quotation marks, and is co-authored by Brubaker, who is a cultural sociologist, and with a historian of Africa named Frederick Cooper. As Brubaker and Cooper note in their chapter, identity is constructed, but they add very insightfully that, and I'm going to give you a long quotation from Brubaker and Cooper. Even in its constructivist guise, the language of identity disposes us to think in terms of bounded groupness. This language does so because even constructivist thinking on identity takes the existence of identity as axiomatic. Identity is always already there as something that individuals and groups have, even if the content of particular identities and the boundaries that mark groups off from one another are conceptualized as always in flux. Even constructivist language tends, therefore, to objectify identity, to treat it as a thing, albeit a malleable one, that people have, or forge, or construct. This tendency to objectify identity deprives us of analytical leverage and constricts political possibilities. It makes it more difficult for us to treat groupness and boundedness as emergent properties of particular structures or conjunctural settings, rather than as always already there in some form. Thus Brubaker and Cooper. I want to make some suggestions here, following in the wake of Brubaker and Cooper. One suggestion is that at this point in our discussion of these issues, it might well be helpful if we analytically, critically oriented historians were to think more critically about the notion of identity. Better, perhaps, if we would think of groupness rather than of identity. The term identity, of course, comes from the Latin idem, same, thus etymologically indicated something that is unified within itself and at some basic level is unchanging, remains at an essential level unchanging over time. Groupness, on the other hand, has no connotations of sameness and might well also help us to remember that people most often belong to multiple and indeed sometimes quite contrary, even conflicting or inconsistent groups. Second, it seems to me that whenever we speak of the construction of groupness, or if you don't like my first suggestion of the construction of identity, we should also in the same moment speak of and effectuate the deconstruction of identity. Here I want to note one instance of the deconstruction of identity in the final chapter of Letourneux's book. That chapter is entitled Post-Nationalism, ? Reopening the Question of Quebec. Here, Letourneaux calls for a changement de paradigme pour saisir la mouvance, I emphasize that, la mouvance actuelle de la société québécoise. And he continues, si cette collectivité consolide sa distinction à l'intérieur de l'ensemble canadien, du fait que ses habitants construisent au jour le jour, une société qui possède des traits spécifiques et qui est de plus en plus francophone, Il reste qu'elle connaît des évolutions, I emphasize that term, evolutions, qui nécessitent de réfléchir, necessitate the refreshing, de réfléchir les visions, si ce n'est pas répertoire de concepts par le biais desquels on l'a saisi depuis le milieu des années 1950. Letourneau's deconstruction of a fixed Québécois identity in part consists of the obvious observation that the prevailing discourse on Québécois identity is invested by a particular political parti pris. There is nothing wrong with the political parti pris, but surely it must justify itself on something more solid than the myth of a continuous national identity running from 1759 to today. But the deconstruction also proceeds by another move on Letourneau's part, and I don't know really how seriously to take the move, but I'm going to choose to take it seriously. A move aimed at deconstructing the idem of identité by introducing in particular two identities within the Québec domain, one of which he calls Montréalicité, that is to say Montreal identity, and the other of which he calls Québecicité, that is to say Quebec City identity. But why stop there? We could just as well have Chicoutimi-cité, Trois-Rivières-cité, Lac-Saint-Jean-cité, Île-de-la-Madeleine-cité, Saguenay-cité, etc. What do we need to understand here? I think that we need to understand that since all identities are constructed, they are equally well susceptible, if not to deconstruction strictly speaking, then at least to the request that they justify themselves on something more than a mythological level. I believe, following Nietzsche, but not only following Nietzsche, that we need to have critical history and not only affirmative history. And we need to have a critical history because of the strong tendency toward fixation, toward congealment, toward frozenness in our relation to the past. Henri Rousseau spoke in his opening discourse of a fixation de l'événement in relation to September 11, 2001. He noted of the September 11, 2001 memorial at so-called Ground Zero, he noted the lack of interpretation, the lack of any mise en cause, and instead the conceiving of the memorial such that la mémoire de l'événement soit sentie presque physiquement par le visiteur. So one brings the visitor in front of that event at the moments of 9/11 are to be kept alive, and they are to be repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated with every visitor. This seems to me to be a non-productive form of memory. And by the way, even though the term historical consciousness is rather vague, I find that I much prefer that term to the also vague term, but I think in some ways more problematic term of memory. This seems to me to be a non-productive form of memory, a repetition memory, perhaps even a memory manifesting a kind of traumatized compulsion. And likewise, identity, which is so often produced out of political interests, or indeed even out of commercial interests. Capitalism has, the system in which we live, often has reasons to generate identity, to create demands for identity so that it can supply goods that will satisfy, or at least feign to satisfy, those demands. It seems to me that we have there a fixation also within the domain of an excessive emphasis on memory. Now, I want to close with, I'm going to quote a letter from the student newspaper of my university. The newspaper is known as the Cavalier Daily. is not dérisoire. In fact, this newspaper has published continuously for about a century. It's called the Cavalier Daily. It's a letter to the Cavalier Daily that was published in the issue of September 11, 2011, exactly 10 years after the attack on the towers in Manhattan and on the other two sites. And it is written by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, which is a secret society of alumni of the University of Virginia. It used to be simply the Sons of Liberty, but the University of Virginia has been co-educational and integrated for quite some time now. So the Sons and Daughters of Liberty write as follows. Dear students of the university, it has been 10 years since September 11, 2001. Well, most of those among us were in our early adolescence then, so they're in their 30s now. The events of that day shattered the bubble inside which our collective childhood had progressed peacefully. Sometimes I think bubbles ought to be shattered, not that this was a good shattering, but still. Whether we saw the smoke and debris in the city itself, and many of our students would have from that period, or from afar on screens in classrooms and homes, like it or not, we as a nation were forced to turn our eyes and minds outward, confronting an increasingly complex and troubling world. All of us remember where we were on September 11. The value of this collective memory cannot be overstated. The shared memories of a culture, whether maintained by stories, institutions, or merely images, constitute the very values that define it. Through the collective memory that is September 11, we strengthen the often tenuous, tangled, and fragile bonds that so precariously bind a democratic, pluralistic society. That is, so long as its memory remains vibrant. Here's a society that cannot exist as a cohesive society without the memory of September 11. That's what is being said. In the aftermath of what happened 10 years ago in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, once the smoke had dissipated and the rubble had begun to be cleared, a mantra emerged for those who lost their lives that day. Never forget. Never forget that the virtues of benevolence and bravery can emanate from ordinary people, that civic virtue is alive and well. Never forget that despite the daily dramas of tests, tryouts, and job hunts, there are indeed far more important things. And if nothing else, let us never, ever forget that liberty is a rare and fragile thing indeed, and that the fire of liberty requires constant tending if it is to light our way forever. Never forget. So it has been for us for the past 10 years. Let it be so for the next 10 years, and for the 10 after that, and for as long as we claim to love liberty. Never forget, so it has been for us. Liberty prevails, the sons and daughters of liberty. I'm glad that this conference is based not on a rhetoric of memory, though I think memory is important, but rather on a rhetoric of dialogue, emphasized very much in the program, a dialogue between us and the remains of the past in the present, and a dialogue between us about the remains of the past in the present. So two dialogues, dialogue with the past and dialogue between us about the disputed significance of the past and about our paths into the future. So that is my paper. I'm not sure what final conclusions I can draw. I can only say that I was delighted to have some initiation into the attempt to teach historical consciousness, or whatever one wants to call it, to students in our primary and secondary schools, and to engage the public also with that issue. Thank you very much.